Welcome to General Biology. Today's presentation is going to be on biogeochemical cycles. We're going to look at water, carbon, and nitrogen. So this is the water cycle. Basically, water evaporates from, it can evaporate from the ground, or it can evaporate from lakes and oceans, or it can evaporate through trees in a process called transpiration, where water is taken up by the tree, travels up the tree to the leaves and evaporates out the stomata on the bottom side of the leaves. Water is also released by organisms. One of the things we give off when we breathe is water vapor. It's a product of cell respiration and we give it off. Water in the air then condenses on dust particles and it forms clouds. Clouds will cause many forms of precipitation. When the water gets heavy enough, it can come down as snow or sleet or hail or just plain rain. That precipitation, when it hits the ground, will run off or get absorbed. If it runs off, it'll run off to lower locations, usually in rivers and streams, eventually to lakes, and eventually down to oceans. The water that enters the soil, we call that infiltration, percolates down into the water table. And that's the water cycle. The carbon cycle deals with a couple situations. One of them is photosynthesis and cell respiration. So carbon dioxide gets taken up by plants. It gets converted into sugars. Those sugars then get consumed by herbivores, and the sugars can either be eaten directly by omnivores or indirectly by carnivores. Those sugars in our body get consumed and cell respiration takes place and carbon dioxide is produced. So all organisms are going to do cell respiration, so all organisms are going to produce carbon dioxide. Doesn't matter if you're a plant, animal, fungus, bacteria, whatever, you're going to produce some carbon dioxide. In addition to that, the burning of fossil fuels has caused quite a bit of additional carbon dioxide to be released into the atmosphere. Wood periodically burns in forest fires that are started by lightning, so wood burning has always been an issue as far as carbon dioxide, but a lot of the fossil fuels that are underground typically aren't being burned. So things like coal and natural gas and oil, we're bringing those to the surface and then burning them. So those typically would have stayed underground, but humans have brought them to the surface and we're burning them, adding additional carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. And volcanoes will periodically add some carbon dioxide to the atmosphere as well. Decaying organisms add a large amount of carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. And this is a little bit of a problem right now because with the addition of the CO2 from fossil fuels, we are warming up. And as we warm up, the places where permafrost existed are starting to melt. Well, when the permafrost melts, all of that frozen decaying material can now start to decay. That has caused increased CO2 levels, which has caused more warming, which has caused faster decay, which has caused increased CO2. So we have a vicious cycle going on up in the Arctic where CO2 levels are increasing even faster because of the decay of the organisms, which has caused much more change near our poles compared to other regions in the Earth. It all gets mixed back up, but there's more temperature change going on in those regions than there is, say, near the equator. And then our last molecule we're going to talk about is nitrogen. The atmosphere is mostly made up of nitrogen, somewhere around 78% nitrogen. That N2 gas gets fixed into the soil a little bit when lightning strikes. When lightning strikes, it actually splits the N2 into two nitrogen atoms. Those nitrogen atoms will then join with an O2 oxygen molecule and form nitric oxide. That nitric oxide gets absorbed by water droplets and forms a slightly nitric acid solution. That nitric acid solution, when it hits the ground, gets absorbed, and that NO2 can be taken in by nitrifying bacteria. Most of the nitrogen that gets into the soil is caused by nitrogen-fixing bacteria. These are bacteria that live in nodules connected to the roots of plants, and they take up nitrogen and fix it into NH3. That gets changed by nitrifying bacteria into NO2, which is a form that plants can use. And then the last way nitrogen gets into the soil is ammonification. This is where we get animal feces or dying and decaying plant matter, or even artificial fertilizers that we throw on the ground. As those dissolve, ammonia gets released, and ammonia gets into the soil and gets converted into nitrous oxide, gets converted by nitrifying bacteria into NO3. That is then a usable source for plants. So those are the ways nitrogen gets into the soil. It usually gets out of the soil through NO3 being used by plants and becoming parts of sugar and proteins, and not sugar, proteins, and then denitrification bacteria taking in NO3 and utilizing that, and then releasing N2 into the atmosphere. Nitrogen is not in sugars, my bad, but we do find nitrogens in proteins and nucleic acids, and so this nitrogen will end up in both those places in plants.